The Kheyran Salt Flats stretched outward in an unbroken sheet of white, a horizon so seamless it erased the idea of distance. Sky and ground fused into one blinding plane, and for miles there was nothing but glare, light without shadow, sound without echo. Ashley Torres led the Recon patrol across that void, a figure moving like a deliberate ghost, each step calculated, unhurried, quiet. The air shimmered in endless distortion, bending the Marines behind her into mirages that seemed to flicker and fade, as if the desert were deciding whether to let them exist. Her gear was sculpted to the land's cruelty. The desert-altered Overwatch suit clung to her frame, bleached marpat mesh blending almost perfectly with the salt crust beneath her boots. A white ghillie veil fluttered faintly over her cracked visor, its half-mirrored lens smeared with dust until it reflected only fragments of her own outline. Her gloves, tan, scored by abrasion, moved with the precision of a mechanic disarming a bomb. The M40A6 rested in her hands, wrapped in strips of burlap bleached bone white, its paint chipped by sand and heat. Every inch of her kit looked scoured, functional, patient. There was no wind, no insects, no birds, just the faint hiss of respirators and the soft crunch of salt crust fracturing under their weight. Each sound carried further than it should, then disappeared into the brightness like it had been swallowed. The land itself felt sentient, a pale intelligence that remembered every footprint. Ashley scanned through her visor's filters, heat, UV, spectral, but the display remained empty, a digital blank. Even the HUD compass jittered, its bearing unsteady as though magnetism itself had bled out of the world. The patrol followed in file 4 Marines, spaced tight, their silhouettes wavering in the heat. They spoke only through clipped radio bursts, each word half lost to interference. Static on grid link, thermals negative, proceeding per waypoint. Communication was procedural, flattened by routine. Yet beneath that composure, the air trembled with unspoken unease. GPS flickered again. Ashley glanced back, raised 2 fingers. Hold spacing. 3 nods followed. Even through the blur, she could read their exhaustion, their skin reflecting the same salt dust that coated her armor. The mission brief had been simple. Verify faint thermal signatures from a downed drone convoy. Gather salvage if viable, and confirm no enemy presence. On paper, it was a recon stroll. In practice, the flats distorted distance, erased reference points, and played tricks on time. The Marines had been walking for hours, yet the horizon remained stubbornly unchanged. The tone of their movement, calm, procedural, was slowly giving way to something primal, an animal instinct that whispered danger without evidence. Ashley adjusted her visor's glare filter, the cracked lens catching the sun in fractured halos. Every step forward produced small ripples underfoot, subtle vibrations that spread through the crust like water disturbed by breath. She noticed them before anyone else. The faint concentric circles that appeared, shimmered, and vanished again. The others didn't seem to see it. Maybe they couldn't. The surface looked fragile, crystalline, deceptive in its stillness. She had the sense that the land beneath wasn't solid at all, but thin, stretched, something hiding below. Her breathing slowed. She crouched and pressed a gloved palm to the salt. It felt colder than the air, dense yet hollow, as if it were transmitting something from below. The silence changed then, not broken, but deepened. A hum so low it bypassed her ears and went straight through bone. She looked up sharply, expecting wind, expecting a gust. Nothing. The team halted behind her, mirroring her stillness without understanding why. For a long moment, she remained in that pose, half kneeling, one hand against the earth, her reflection dim on the mirrored crust. The tremor pulsed again, faint and deliberate, like a heartbeat answering her touch. She realized it came when they moved, when mass shifted, when the salt flexed. Instinct drew her perfectly still. Sweat trickled under her collar. The hum faded, then returned as the Marine behind her adjusted his stance. The connection was unmistakable now. Movement provoked it. The ground was listening. She motioned sharply. Freeze. The order passed silently down the line. 4 statues stood against the horizon's glare. Shadows fused to the white beneath their boots. Ashley's thoughts narrowed to a single discipline: stillness as armor. Her pulse slowed to match the rhythm of the vibrations. Training taking over. Fear translated into control. In that breathless pause, she understood that survival here wasn't about aggression or speed. It was about reading the battlefield before it revealed itself. The air around them shimmered harder, a mirage thickening like smoke. Her visor flickered with static, digital snow cutting across the horizon feed. She adjusted focus, but the landscape remained blank, utterly featureless, without color or depth. The heat bled detail from everything, even her own outline. The hum subsided again, leaving only the faint crackle of comm interference and the rasp of her breathing. She stayed kneeling, eyes forward, scanning a world that offered no threat and yet promised violence in its perfection. Somewhere deep beneath the crust, something waited. Machine, sensor, or instinct. She couldn't tell. The salt felt alive, patient, ancient. She rose slowly, movements fluid, and her visor caught her reflection in the pale surface below, a shape of armor and dust and silence, indistinguishable from the desert that surrounded her. For the first time, she saw how fragile her own existence looked against this white infinity. Static flared again across her display. She stood in absolute quiet, scanning a horizon that refused to end. Behind her, the patrol waited for a command that didn't come. The only sound was the faint hum, reawakening beneath her boots. Subtle, but certain. She whispered under her breath, voice lost in the heat. The desert hums before it kills. And for the first time, Ashley felt the desert's intelligence pressing back, unseen, unprovoked, alive. The battlefield had already started speaking. She had only just begun to listen. The hum beneath Ashley's boots thickened into a rhythm, steady, deliberate, alive. What had been a tremor now pulsed with intent, each vibration measured, returning like sonar. The Marines continued forward, unaware that the ground was speaking back. Ashley slowed, reading it through her soles, through the slight flex of her knees, through the air itself. The desert was no longer static. It had begun to breathe. She knelt, glove pressed against the salt crust. The vibration wasn't natural. It had pattern, 3 long pulses, 1 short, repeated, exact, mechanical. Her visor displayed faint seismic fluctuations, ghost traces flickering across the edge of her HUD before fading again. Someone was manipulating the land. The Kheyran Flats weren't reacting to their movement. They were responding to it. Ashley raised a hand to halt the patrol. They froze, outlines shimmering in the distance like heat made mirages. The silence around them stretched thin, too perfect, too clean. Then, the earth behind them erupted. The first explosion came without warning, a column of white dust and shattered salt stabbing skyward. No sound reached them at first, only light, blinding and pure. Then, seconds later, a deep concussion rolled across the flats, pushing the air through their chests like a tidal wave. Salt rained down in flakes. The detonation left behind a smooth crater, rimmed in glowing particles that caught the sun like frost. Ashley didn't move. She watched the ripples in the crust fan outward from the blast zone, concentric, rhythmic, still communicating. Another pulse came, closer this time, vibrating through her knees. She saw the pattern again. Whoever was detonating the mines wasn't guessing. They were listening for movement. Her HUD went to static. The feed cut, glitched, returned with horizontal lines of interference. The glare refracted through the dust, turning the world into a mosaic of white fire. The Marines behind her were silhouettes now, their gear blurred into the mirage. One shouted something, muffled through comm distortion. Another turned, scanning the horizon with rising panic. The landscape gave nothing back, only silence, only reflection. "Stay down," Ashley ordered, voice low, deliberate. "Don't move." The second detonation struck to their left, closer, controlled. A white geyser swallowed the place where one of their sensor beacons had landed. The explosion wasn't random. It was a test shot, precisely measured, striking exactly where human weight had compressed the crust. The ground had become a chessboard, squares of death triggered by unseen hands. A third blast rolled through the flats. The shockwave knocked one Marine backward. His visor struck the salt, leaving a crack across the surface. He tried to rise, but Ashley's hand shot out, not to pull him up, but to keep him still. The desert punished movement. She was beginning to understand the rules. The air smelled faintly metallic now, sharp as burnt circuitry. Each explosion threw dust so fine it clung to their armor, settling over their visors until everything blurred white. Ashley wiped hers with a gloved finger, leaving streaks that distorted her vision further. Her own reflection stared back from the cracked lens, pale, silent, uncertain. The Marines began to argue over comms, their voices half swallowed by static. "It's random. We need to move now. We'll be sitting ducks if we actually cut them off." "No. They're timing us. Someone's watching." The statement hung there, stark and unchallengeable. She could feel their hesitation shift to fear. She didn't look back. Her eyes were fixed on the terrain, studying, reading, memorizing. Every tremor had a rhythm. Every pause had intention. She realized the detonations followed a pattern of observation. Whoever controlled them wasn't trying to annihilate the patrol outright. They were testing, collecting data, learning reaction time. The symbolic object of safety, the ground beneath them, had become the instrument of their exposure. Ashley's pulse stayed low. She had trained for this kind of moment, when instinct screamed run, but logic whispered wait. She stayed still, breathing in through her nose, exhaling slow through the respirator valve. The silence after the last blast cut sharper than sound. Through the veil of salt haze, she lifted her rifle and swept the horizon. Every movement was minimal, measured, quiet. The motifs played out around her, ripples forming seconds before a distant detonation, white dust clinging to her visor, silence collapsing back into place after each concussion. Time stretched. The flats no longer looked empty. They shimmered with invisible boundaries, like veins beneath glass. Then she saw it, a flicker at the far edge of visibility. Something metallic glinting just once, almost swallowed by the mirage. She magnified through her scope, fighting distortion. The shape was small, angular, motionless, positioned atop a ridge miles away. A remote detonator. Maybe. A controller? A watcher? She lowered the rifle. Exhale slow, deliberate. The air seemed to hold its breath with her, around her. The team waited, still, exhausted, staring at a landscape that could kill them for moving. The hum returned, faint but insistent. It wasn't random anymore. It was listening for her next decision. Ashley whispered under her breath, words meant for no one but the desert. "If they're watching," she said, "they'll have to blink first." Her reflection ghosted back at her from the visor, a Marine shaped by silence, suspended between motion and death. The desert had chosen its language, and now she knew how to listen. The detonations found a rhythm. What had begun as chaos now unfolded with the precision of a machine, a metronome of death measured in seconds and tremors. Ashley Torres no longer heard the blasts as sound. She felt them, bone-deep pulses marking time. The Kheyran Salt Flats had become a clock face, each explosion a tick toward oblivion. Around her, the Marines stood trapped on a vast invisible grid, 4 points in a game they hadn't realized they were playing. She crouched low, counting under her breath. 4 seconds between pulses, 2.7 between detonations. The pattern was clean, deliberate. Whoever sat behind the detonator wasn't guessing. They were orchestrating. Each concussion threw a geyser of salt skyward, particles suspended mid-air in shimmering arcs, as if gravity itself had hesitated. The silence between was worse than the noise, a vacuum that pressed on the skull, demanding obedience. Ashley's visor flickered again, cracked lens catching the flash of each explosion as a fractured halo. Her own reflection stared back at her in pieces, one eye, half a jawline, a blur of white light. The desert wanted to erase her, but it hadn't yet learned how. She steadied her breathing, heartbeat syncing with the detonations. The rifle cradled against her chest, not as weapon, but as metronome. Inhale, hold, move, freeze. The Marines behind her twitched, uncertain. One whispered into comms, voice clipped with panic. "We can't stay still. It's closing in." Another shook his head violently, the gesture sending fine trails of dust spiraling upward. Ashley held out a hand, flat, calm, deliberate. "No movement," she ordered. "Not until I say—" The silence that followed was brittle. Every man suspended between trust and terror. The next explosion hit to their right, close enough that salt spray peppered their armor like glass. The shockwave rolled through them, but Ashley didn't flinch. Instead, she watched how the ripple spread across the surface, outward, concentric, losing strength at 12 meters. There, between waves, the crust barely flexed. A safe pocket. She reached into her pouch, pulled a small cylinder, and twisted the cap. A red dust puffed from its nozzle. Fine powder meant for wind marking. She tossed it forward. The dust hung in still air, unmoved, suspended. Safe zone confirmed. She motioned silently. "Follow my steps exactly." They moved like clock hands. Slow, precise, mechanical. Ashley's boots sank millimeters into the crust. Every sound of motion was deafening. Ahead, the world rippled again. She waited. The tremor passed under her without detonating. The mines weren't triggered by motion alone. They listened for weight shifts, cadence, hesitation. She understood now the enemy wasn't detonating at random. They were studying tempo. Then it happened. The break. One Marine, nerves shredded, bolted. He tore out of formation, sprinting across the flats in a burst of motion. "Wait!" Ashley shouted, but it was already too late. The earth answered instantly. A column of white erupted beneath him, swallowing his form in silence. No sound, no scream. Only the rising plume of salt catching sunlight like frozen smoke. When the dust cleared, he was gone. Nothing left but ripples. The others froze. The desert held its breath. Ashley's eyes stayed on the crater, her expression unmoving. "This is not random," she said quietly into comms. "It's rhythm. Follow mine, or you die." She resumed counting. 4 seconds. 2.7. Her voice dropped into a whisper. She moved, then stopped, a statue between storms. Every step a calculation, every breath an act of control. The other 2 Marines mirrored her, their terror reshaped into imitation. She didn't look back, only forward, scanning for the next ripple, the next twitch in the ground's heartbeat. A blast struck further away now, deliberate misdirection. Whoever controlled the detonations had realized she'd begun to read them. Ashley smiled faintly, invisible beneath her respirator. The desert had underestimated the Marine discipline it mocked. Another plume rose, farther out this time, dust glowing under the midday light. The particles drifted down in slow motion, landing on her shoulders like ash. She blinked behind her visor. The cracked lens fractured the view into prisms of white, gold, and silence. For the first time, she didn't see chaos. She saw pattern. Each explosion fell exactly where she expected, like punctuation in a language she'd begun to understand. They advanced again, 10 meters, 15. The detonations followed the same tempo but grew weaker, less confident, as if whoever controlled them was losing her trail. Ashley exhaled, her body becoming one with the battlefield's rhythm. The motifs repeated around her rippling ground, drifting salt plumes, the oppressive absence of color, the entire world reduced to pulse, pause, breath. The next explosion blossomed at the horizon, vast and soundless, a white flower suspended mid-air. Ashley stopped walking. The Marines behind her stopped too. The blast froze in her cracked visor, mirrored as a halo split by fissures, the symbol of fragile control against annihilation. She stood perfectly still, letting dust settle around her, letting silence reclaim the air. The fear was gone. In its place was something quieter, deeper, reverence. She wasn't surviving against the rhythm anymore. She was inside it. She knew when the next tremor would come before it arrived. She could feel the mind's pulse beneath her heartbeat, a strange harmony between machine and body. She looked toward the horizon, eyes calm, mind utterly still. The detonations faded, their pattern spent, their logic broken. Ashley stood alone amid drifting salt and light, her figure half dissolved by glare. The desert had lost its advantage. She had learned to listen better than it could speak. Her visor reflected the aftermath, halos of dust floating weightless, sunlight fractured into spectral lines. In that mirror of ruin and precision, she saw herself disappear into the landscape, no longer foreign to it. Her thought rose like breath against the inside of her mask. Stillness is the last language the enemy doesn't speak, and in that silence, total, absolute, the desert seemed to bow. The basin appeared like an indentation in glass, shallow, almost imperceptible, but enough to grant cover from the desert's violent symmetry. Ashley Torres led the two surviving Marines down its slope, each step deliberate, each sound reduced to breath and grit. The detonations had stopped their rhythm for the first time in hours. Above them, the horizon blurred into a pale wall of haze. Below, the salt crust had turned gray-white under drifting dust. It fell like snow, coating their armor until they looked carved from the same material that threatened to consume them. The air was dense with silence. Every breath felt amplified inside her respirator, every exhale a metronome against her visor's static flicker. Ashley scanned the basin with her scope, not for heat, not for movement, but for intention. The pattern of the explosions had not been random. There had been hesitation between each pulse, variance measured not by range but by reaction time. Someone had been watching them, testing their response. Then she saw it. Faint, reflective threads crisscrossing the surface like veins under translucent skin. Cables, thin as wire, woven through the salt, running from the basin's center toward the ridgeline. She followed the glint visually, tracing its path across the desert floor. The sight was both elegant and horrifying, the human will embedded into terrain, intelligence fused to earth. The land was not merely armed, it was occupied. These lines were the synapses of control. She motioned for the others to hold position and dropped to a prone stance. Her visor's cracked lens divided the landscape into fragments, turning the ridge beyond into a mosaic of glare. Through the shimmer, a faint silhouette appeared, a figure half buried, face covered by cloth, body motionless except for one arm. The hand moved in measured intervals, tapping at a control pad connected to the vein like cables. Each touch correlated to the detonations. The figure wasn't fighting. He was studying. Ashley exhaled slowly, the breath fogging her visor for an instant. The desert's hum vibrated faintly under her chest plate, not angry now, but watchful. She steadied the M40A6, extending the bipod legs into the salt crust with the same reverence one might give a sacred instrument. Her gloves brushed away loose dust from the rifle's scope. The sound was like paper against glass. The world beyond the lens narrowed to one rectangle of brightness, one heartbeat of clarity. She timed her breathing to the memory of the detonations. Inhale. The hum deepened somewhere in the distance. Hold. A faint tremor brushed under her ribs. Exhale. Silence. The rhythm that had once hunted her now guided her aim. Ashley understood, in that suspended calm, that she was no longer reacting. She was anticipating. The last tremor rippled through the crust, a soft, residual echo of the previous wave. She adjusted for it, just a fraction of an angle, accounting for air displacement that would ripple milliseconds after detonation. Her finger rested on the trigger, pressure light, heartbeat steady. The land itself seemed to pause. Then she fired. The rifle's report vanished into the sound of the explosion that erupted seconds later. A perfect overlap of chaos and control. The recoil shuddered through her arms, a physical echo of the ground's own movement. Dust erupted upward, concealing everything in a suspended bloom of white. There was no sound, only vibration. Then, stillness. Ashley remained behind the scope for a long time, waiting for the dust to settle. The hum had stopped. The static on her visor quieted to a single flicker, then cleared completely. The desert was motionless again, stripped of its pulse. When she finally rose, the others followed, weapons half raised, uncertain whether the silence was victory or ambush. The ridge loomed faintly ahead, its shape softened by haze. Ashley advanced first, boots whispering against the salt. The world had changed tone, not relief, but reverence. The desert, for the first time, seemed to be listening back. At the ridge's base, she found what she had seen: a crude field console half buried in salt, connected by lines of DEET cord and improvised seismic sensors. The operator, a body now still, had fallen beside it, face obscured, hands dusted white. The device itself was simple copper wires, cracked solar panels, a repurposed control pad. Yet its design was brilliant in its cruelty, not built to kill efficiently, but to observe. The detonations had been psychological, a test of endurance and fear, a machine of patience, not war. Ashley crouched, studying the console's surface, the soft light reflecting across her visor. The fractured glass that once split her reflection now seemed whole in the stillness. The symbolic object, her visor, captured the battlefield unbroken for the first time. She understood what the desert had been teaching the war was never about movement or fire. It was about understanding the silence between, without ceremony. She stepped onto the device. The crunch of salt gave beneath her boot as she pressed down. The control panel shattered, sparks snapping weakly in the dust before fading. The sound was final, not destruction, but closure. The cables went dark, and the faint tremor in the ground ceased entirely. The air hung heavy, pure, clean. The dust around them settled in slow descent, tiny flakes glowing under the pale sun. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was listening. The desert, stripped of interference, reflected the Marines like a mirror. Ashley looked down and saw herself, whole, sharp, unmoving, no distortion, no fragmentation. She turned to the others. "We're done here," she said softly. They nodded, still wordless, eyes scanning the endless plain. Above them, the light diffused into a warm, silent blur, turning every shadow into a ghost of its former self. As they began to move again, Ashley cast one last look over the flats, the field of battle reduced to stillness. Her reflection rippled faintly across the crust as she stepped forward, each print vanishing seconds after it formed. Her thought surfaced quietly, barely a whisper in her own mind. We don't walk the battlefield. It walks us. And as she moved on, the desert, that once living adversary, remained utterly silent, as though, for a moment, it understood. The desert had gone silent. The detonations that once shook the world to its bones had faded into a memory, leaving behind a stillness too complete to feel safe, too vast to distrust. The Kheyran Salt Flats stretched endlessly beneath the lowering sun, scarred, cratered, and beautiful. Dust motes drifted in slow spirals through amber light, and the salt itself shimmered pink and gold like the surface of another planet. 3 figures moved through that fading glow, each one muted, spectral, fragile against the endless horizon. Ashley Torres led them wordlessly, her rifle slung low, the cracked visor of her helmet catching fragments of the dying sun. The mirrored glass, once fractured by heat and grit, now glowed with warm reflection, streaked in pale orange dust. Every breath through her respirator sounded heavier than the air itself. Each step left a soft print that would disappear in minutes under drifting powder, as if the desert refused to let them leave a mark. The world had shifted from hostility to silence, from enemy to witness. Around them, the craters left by the detonations shone faintly, hollow bowls of white gold light. Each one seemed to hum with memory. The echo of violence cooled into stillness. The Marines walked among them like archaeologists of their own survival. There was no talk of victory, no adrenaline left to spend. They moved slowly, reverently, as though walking through a graveyard that had learned to forgive. Ashley's movement was deliberate, unhurried, her M40A6 no longer an extension of tension, but of presence. Her body was relaxed yet vigilant, every motion purposeful. She had become quiet inside, emptied of the need to predict, control, or command. The land had taught her a language older than tactics, a dialogue of patience, vibration, and silence. Now, each step answered it. The soundscape was minimal, the faint rasp of equipment straps, the grind of boots over crystalline crust, the whisper of respirators. Even their shadows seemed careful not to intrude. The horizon bled out into colorless light, the kind that erases scale. The Marines appeared smaller, dissolving as they walked, until even their outlines began to blur in the haze. Ashley slowed her pace, her eyes tracing the ripples across the salt crust, faint waves that had once signaled danger. Now they were still, smooth, resting like breath after exertion. The dust clung to her gloves, her sleeves, the creases of her armor. When she lifted her hand to adjust her visor, the motion felt like an interruption to something sacred. For the first time since the ambush began, she felt reluctant to move. One of the surviving Marines, his voice brittle with exhaustion, broke the long silence. "How did you know when to move?" he asked. Ashley didn't answer right away. She stopped, turning her head toward him, her visor catching the dim reflection of his silhouette. The sun flickered across the cracked lens, splitting his image in two. "Finally," she said. "I didn't. I listened until it stopped trying to speak first." Her tone was simple, stripped of explanation. The words hung there, caught in the air between them, a truth that didn't need understanding to be believed. The Marine nodded once, the motion slow, as if he'd received an order. They walked on. The motifs played themselves out softly, the rhythm of boots aligning with breathing, the ripples smoothing behind them, the silence between steps forming a cadence that was neither human nor machine. It was the rhythm of recovery, of equilibrium, rediscovered. The desert had stopped attacking, but it hadn't stopped watching. Ashley could feel that, not menace, but acknowledgement. The light deepened toward crimson. Dust motes burned like embers as they fell. The three Marines crossed a field of frozen craters, their path weaving through shallow depressions that reflected the sun in broken rings. The farther they moved, the less defined their reflections became. Stretched, elongated, finally thinning into ghostly echoes across the mirror surface. Ashley paused once more, turning to look back. The basin they had left behind lay quiet and colorless now. No longer a battlefield, but a field of marks that caught the evening glow. Each crater was precise, symmetrical, and eerily serene. The desert had absorbed its own violence, leaving only geometry behind. Her visor caught the view and refracted it, the scars of the land mirrored over her faceplate, merging with her own features in faint outline. For a moment, marine and terrain looked identical, both weathered, both quiet, both changed. The symbolic object, her visor, no longer fractured her reflection. It had become whole again, unbroken in its clarity. The world dimmed as the sun slipped beneath the edge of the horizon. Light condensed into one long streak of fire that ran along the flats, painting them in molten amber. The hum returned, faint, low, but not threatening. It vibrated gently beneath their boots, more heartbeat than warning. Ashley closed her eyes for a second, feeling it through her soles, through her chest, through the rifle against her shoulder. It was no longer the sound of the desert hunting. It was the sound of it breathing. They kept walking. No one spoke again. The silence had shape now, structure, meaning. The wind, so long absent, finally stirred, lifting trails of white dust behind their steps, erasing their prints as they went. The sky above them bled into violet, then to deep gray. Far ahead, the horizon shimmered with residual light. Ashley's silhouette led the way, a dark figure dissolving slowly into gold. Her visor flared once, catching the last of the sun, a pulse of brightness, before the reflection faded into shadow. The hum beneath her feet pulsed once more, steady, alive. She felt it synchronize with her heartbeat, not as threat, but as understanding. Marine and land, soldier and silence, pulse and dust, all moving to the same rhythm now. And as the darkness took hold, the desert mirrored her calm, vast and unbroken. In its silence, there was no victory, only endurance, only balance, only the faint echo of life still moving forward.